U.S. history. Welcome back to class. Okay, today I think I have a pretty engaging and fun lesson that relates to this time in history, and I think it'll kind of bridge to maybe some modern day issues that are playing out in America right now. So I have a song that I want you to listen to, but before you get to that, you should be hopefully starting out with this commentary video, and then I have a very brief documentary. That's what you should view right after this. And finally, view Bob Dylan's song, The Hurricane. Now, what's the hurricane about? Is it talking about a literal hurricane happening down in Florida? Not at all. Actually, the hurricane, as it pertains to this song and what we're talking about today, was the nickname for a boxer, Rubin Carter, who was an up-and-coming middleweight boxer who was really good. He was contending to be heavyweight champ of the world, and then he ends up being, and I believe this all happened in 1967, so kind of height of the civil rights movement and all the civil turmoil and racial unrest happening in the country. He happens to be in the wrong place at the wrong time one night. A triple murder ends up happening, and the police in the New Jersey town where he was living at, and this particular department was, I guess, kind of notoriously a racist department, doctored some evidence. They didn't like him for one reason or another, and they, of course, want to get a conviction, and they want to tie up the murders. It looks better for police if they're able to solve crimes, right? And doctor some evidence. He ends up going to trial, gets convicted of murder. Apparently, from all I know about it, it was kind of a shady trial, and he's wrongfully convicted, and he's incarcerated for several decades. While he's in prison, I mean, there were a lot of fishy things about the way this investigation went down, which the documentary will get into this a little bit today. A few years later, after he is in prison, Bob Dylan, who is an epically famous musician from this era, who honestly, I'm not a huge Bob Dylan fan. He does folk style music, really kind of twangy instrumentals, but he was very, very popular in this era. He does a song on Rubin, the Hurricane Carter, called The Hurricane, where he profiles everything that went down and kind of sheds light and exposes this story to America abroad, all right? Now, I will say, now, I'm not a super big Bob Dylan fan, just personally. It's not really my taste. However, I will say this is the one Bob Dylan song that I absolutely love. It's a pretty long song, but man, I think he knocked this one out of the park. I'm not exaggerating when I say I love this song. It is on several different playlists that I have. I also think it's fascinating because it's something that ties into history. Now, Bob Dylan doing that song didn't get Rubin Carter out of prison. However, I think this is almost 2 decades later. There was a young black student who was really kind of in a troubled stage of his life and kind of questioning things. And he learns about Rubin Carter's story. And he, with the assistance of two actually white Canadian people that were attorneys, they start digging into this case. He starts writing letters to Rubin Carter saying, man, I feel for you. This is, I looked into your conviction. It looks like it's a bunch of nonsense. And they start corresponding back and forth. And actually, they dig into the case and kind of reopen this cold case and are able to get Rubin Carter exonerated, and he gets out of prison. I think it's a really cool story. Probably about 15, 20 years ago, a movie came out where Denzel Washington plays the lead. He is Rubin the Hurricane Carter, and it kind of profiles that whole story. So not so much focusing on Rubin Carter back in the day, although there are some flashbacks, but it really gets into the whole the appeal case and him getting out of prison. So if this is a story that would interest you, to my knowledge, I have watched the movie The Hurricane before. I thought it was pretty entertaining, and to my knowledge, it's pretty darn accurate too. So this is one that I'm trying to cover a good song from back in this era in history. I believe Carter was convicted in 1967, and this Bob Dylan song came out in 1975. So a few years later, but still in this kind of general area in history, the Vietnam War, Civil Rights, Cold War era, to throw a lot of terms at you. And I love the song. I think it's an interesting piece of history, and I thought it especially relates to just everything that's happening today, because obviously, unless you've been hiding in a cave, you have heard of the issue of systemic racism. and the police unfairly targeting young black men. Well, you can look at the stats, and I think that's an ongoing political debate. And I think there's a lot of gray area in there as to like how racist America is or our systems today. But one thing that I think is undeniable as a history teacher is if you go back to this era in history, or really before, from kind of the foundations of America on through to the civil rights movement, at least, there was a high degree of racism. And at that point, I would be totally comfortable in saying it was systemic racism too, because, you can go back to slavery days, obviously. Blacks in the South were enslaved due to, the color of their skin. But even after the Civil War and after slavery, you had those Jim Crow laws we've talked about, where it is just two separate standards. It definitely was systemic racism because you saw different laws that applied to black people in the southern states, and even in the northern states that didn't have it, because this murder, the triple murder and conviction, happens in the state of New Jersey, a northern state. You still saw double standards, even though it might not be written into the law specifically, where blacks were treated differently and often unfairly targeted by police in this era. Fortunately, I do think things have gotten better throughout history and we're bending towards a more just, fair society. I think the evidence for that is pretty overwhelming. But we're covering this era in history, and, I don't want to unfairly beat up on police and say all police are racist or anything like that, which you could come away from this story kind of feeling like that. But there are definitely certain departments around the country that have more of a legacy or a tradition of racism. And I'm not too familiar with the different law enforcement departments in New Jersey. But from what I know of this story, apparently this town where this happened, it was, there were a lot of allegations that these officers were pretty racist. And then I think when you follow the events of this story, because I do think it's important to look into individual cases and decide things on their own merits. I don't like saying all police are racist or all of one group or another, because there's hundreds of thousands of police officers in the country. But I think absolutely in this case, when you go look at the evidence and the story of Rubin Carter, my apologies there was some fishy stuff going on, and it seems like it absolutely was. Rubin Carter was a big name. He was an up-and-coming star, and he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And because he was a black guy, these cops are relentless and go after him and really unfairly plant some evidence to lead to his conviction. So I hope you like this story. I hope you find it interesting. Kind of a compelling story. Next up, as soon as you finish this video, go tune into the 13-minute documentary that I have on it, where it really kind of highlights and sums up the whole case. If you really like that, I would encourage you to go check out the movie, The Hurricane, but I'm not attaching that, or we don't really have time to watch that movie in class this year. But the last thing I want you to wrap up with is listen to the song, The Hurricane. I absolutely love the song. I hope you like it too. It's a good tune for just entertainment value. And because it ties into an actual historical event, I think that makes it all that much better. Once you finish that up, and hopefully you've viewed the other music posts I have put up this week, some Motown music videos, and then we got into the British invasion, a lot of rock and roll bands that were coming in this era from across the pond over in England. Then the Q&A that I'm putting up today will tie into all the music posts from this week. So hopefully you viewed all those, and I'll give you through to the rest of the week to respond to that Q&A. Okay, kick back, watch the documentary, then enjoy the music video, and let me know what you think on the Q&A. See ya.